Hello everyone, Ventrua back with the 3.25 Trickster Hexblast update, and I have to start out by saying not that much has changed compared to last league, which is amazing news because this build was insanely good at the start of last league, and it's probably gonna be almost as good this league. The only thing that we know that has changed that has been mentioned in the reveal video is that Sandstorm Visage is now rarer, but hopefully we already have some fixes to this. And the build is more than good enough without Sandstorm Visage, and eventually, once we get Sandstorm Visage, it's gonna be better than before because they are also buffing the base crit on bases, including wands, which means it's gonna be even easier to get crit capped, and we will be able to get potentially even more damage than last league. First off, I wanna explain how my path of building works. So there's an extensive node section for leveling, what you need for a swap, and some small crafting stuff. And then there is loadouts, which is a new function of path of building, which allows you to swap multiple things at once. So for example, when I switch to a different loadout, like Pre-Sandstorm, it switches the skill tree, it switches the skills, it switches the items and the config. So if you're gonna be checking out different parts of the build, please use this loadout function as it's gonna be the easiest, so nothing gets messed up. And it should just make everything way easier for you and for me for making like future build guides, as it's an amazing function and it actually makes it so much easier for build creators to have multiple setups within one PoB. Let's quickly go over what Hexblast is and how this build actually functions, as I don't think it's entirely trivial, so I just want to quickly go over everything. It does chaos damage, but it is resisted by the lowest resistance instead, which in our case will mean that we will be using elemental resistances, as those are way easier to lower than chaos resistances, and it is an extreme advantage for us to be able to generate more damage. All damage can ignite, freeze, and choke. This is an extremely strong stat, because even though we are doing pure chaos damage, we are still using that full chaos damage to inflict freezes and shocks. We don't really care about ignite, but the freeze and choke is super important, both for our survivability and for our damage. 100% more damage if the enemy is hexed, and 100% chance to remove a hex after damaging. So what this means is basically every time we use Hexblast, we want the enemy to be hexed, and we accomplish this by using Curse on Hit and either Blasphemy or Profane Proxy with Skitterbots to actually have hex on enemies that we are just approaching to. And the final way this build actually is all put together is the fact that normally Hexblast has cast time of 1 second, which makes it not that good, right? What do? You just put it on a mine, and then the cast time doesn't matter. Every mine has the same throw speed, and that is how we circumvent that. Crit chance of Hexblast is very low, which usually is solved by Sandstorm Visage, but again, we will be solving it in other ways for the early game. It's not going to be a big issue. It might be an issue on like day 1, but by day 2, I don't think you will even notice this, as we can increase this number up to 7%, and that is more than enough to get close to crit capped anyways. The question I got the most last league was, why are you playing Trickster? And for me, the main reason was the fact that Trickster is just the most well-rounded ascendancy, and it feels the best in terms of gameplay. Because you get a lot of action speed early and mind throwing speed from Swift Killer and One Step Ahead, which makes the feeling of the build a lot better for early game while you are lacking throw speed, because you are not self-stunning yourself every time you throw mines with Minefield. It also gets a lot of defense with Spellbreaker endgame, and overall I just think Trickster is very well rounded. It is good for bossing, it is good for Sanctum, it is fine for mapping, it is fine for Guardian rotations. It can do pretty much all content in this game except like extreme juice beyond Delirium maps. Even tier 17s were amazing on Trickster. Like I was running them unID'd on like day 2 of the league from last league, and tier 17s are a lot easier today, so I don't see this build struggling with them. A lot of people think Saboteur is a trap and mine ascendancy. I don't think it's bad. Like it definitely gives you something. I just don't think it gives you more than Trickster in any way. And I wouldn't play Saboteur over Trickster in pretty much any scenario. There's also ascendancies that are worth considering though. It's Pathfinder, it's Assassin, and Occultist, which can all go for power charge stacking setups that can be really good, especially for Sanctum. They do tend to be a bit ZHP, but for Pathfinder specifically, you can even make an endgame version that is very tanky, obviously abusing stuff like Progenesis and whatnot, but I think the Pathfinder endgame version is pretty good. I just feel like Pathfinder needs a lot early on to get going, and it is way more difficult to put together. When it comes to Assassin and Occultist, they are just lacking defenses, but they feel really good in Sanctum, and they just have a lot of damage early on. And if you can get the power charge stacking set up super early, they are probably really good, even for like boss killing and whatnot. But I would be worried that stuff like Garala Cash is going to be expensive. Stuff like Badge of the Brotherhood is going to be expensive. But it is hard to predict until we see the actual league start. But especially in Garala Cash's case, I would be very careful in planning a power charge stacker that relies on it on day 1 or day 2 of the league. And it's kind of nice that the Trickster doesn't have that issue. What is the best way to level this build? Well, that is an excellent question, and I wish I knew the answer to this. But I think Stormblast Mine into Pyroclast Mine is a pretty good option, and that is what I did in preparation for last league leveling, where I did a full run. I will make sure to leave this link in the description. It was about 330-ish, so pretty solid run, and it was quite smooth, not super fast, but you only use Flame Dash for movement, so it's very easy to execute. And the only difficult part of that run is executing the Pyroclast chains to actually get damage from it. And sadly, you cannot use automation when you are using Pyroclast Mine, but that is just something you have to deal with for a few hours and then never have to deal with it again. Alternatively, you could use Rolling Magma for early game, but I haven't actually tested this, but I have seen people level Shadow with Rolling Magma, and it was also completely fine. You can swap to Hexblast as soon as you get Dreadarch and have library completed with charge mines available. So level 31 plus, you can switch to Hexblast if you want to. But I think you should plan on not having it, because you don't know if maybe Dreadarch is going to be 5C, maybe the trade side is not going to work. So I would highly recommend doing most of the campaign without Hexblast, maybe till at least Cruel up, and then you can practice switching if you are going to do any practice runs. But I can tell you for sure Pyroclast is good enough to get you to Act 10, and after that you want to switch to Hexblast, as Pyroclast doesn't really feel good in mobs. Which is one of the reasons why I don't really recommend this build in SSF, as it might be difficult to obtain the curse on hit early on, and I would probably just stay away from it as the first build in SSF. There's plenty of other builds you can play, and Hexblast can be an excellent second build in SSF, as it is really good boss killer once you get everything going for it. When you want to swap to Hexblast, you really need to have certain things. Number 1 is Curse on Hit. As I mentioned, usually the most common thing is going to be Dreadarch at this point, but there are also some alternatives. Gloves with a Curse, ideally Ela Weakness, but if you have Enfeeble or Temp Chains and you really want to swap, and you are like approaching maps, sure, you can go ahead and equip your Enfeeble Temp Chain gloves, it's completely fine. Or a rare ring with a Curse on Hit, Flammability, Frostbite, Conductivity, or Elemental Weakness, which can come either from Delve or from Influence Rings. Early on, of course, it's not going to be from Influence Rings, it would be from Delve Rings, but by day 2, Influence Rings become quite accessible. Next thing you have to run is a Blasphemy with Elemental Weakness or Flammability if you already have Elemental Weakness on your gloves or ring, until you get Profane Proxy, and then you can switch to Blasphemy to Skitterbots. Make sure to put Profane Proxy in your right ring slot to lose only the Shocking Skitterbot, as you don't really care about that one because we shock ourselves normally. Next thing you have to pay attention to is the mana on Hexblast. So what you want to do is you go to PoB, you check what your total mine limit is. So you go here, active mine limit 18, and then you click the active mine limit here. And you need to make sure you can throw an additional mine afterward. So you can see my Hexblast costs 43 mana, and I have 58 mana unreserved after I throw all 18 mines. So we are fine with that setup. And that is how you want to check in case you are missing any. If you don't have enough mana to throw the additional set of mines, it's going to feel really clunky, and you have to like either drop a link or click a mana node. Sometimes my tree will have an extra mana node or two. You should definitely check out what the setup says to do, but you might have to adjust based on your own like situation. And if you have too much mana left, you might be able to drop like a node on the cluster or these mana nodes. Just play it by ear. It shouldn't be too hard to understand once you get this basic principle. Early on, you want to spend your currency for a Dreadarch and the Tenur, as these gloves are really good damage without having a real significant downside. And then you want to save up for either Profane Proxy, save up for Curse on Hit Ring or Gloves, or work towards your first cluster setup. Ideally, we would get 8 point chaos, but 8 point spell damage is also good enough. Because all we really care about is the medium clusters. Medium trap and mind damage cluster with eye level 50 plus, and then we reforge crit a few times. I think it's the average of like 3 or 4 reforges, and we get Gorilla Tactics and Surprise Sabotage, which is so strong that there's nothing on the skill tree that can ever compete with it, and that is the reason why we prioritize clusters so highly. It's also pretty hard to actually spend points on this build past certain points, so I would highly recommend working towards it early on. I also think once you get towards like the level 90-ish, when your Hexblast actually starts costing a lot of mana, I would recommend getting a small Reservation cluster with Sublime Form, or getting Evasion cluster with Sublime Form if you cannot get a Reservation cluster due to cost. Otherwise, the early gear is very basic in this PoB, and the only thing that is worth mentioning is you can use either Restless Ward or Carcass Jack if you want to use a unique body armor. They're both very solid. I used Carcass Jack last league and I just dropped Blast Waves completely, and that was my only source of AoE, and it felt really good. So up to you what you prefer. I mean, I think Restless Ward is probably better, but either of them is a solid choice. You can also use a rare, especially with the new rare bases, but we don't really know how obtainable those will be and how easy they will be to roll. You would probably roll it with like Dense Fossils or something and then grab the Life Mastery, but hard to say until we see their availability. The PoB I put the most effort into was the Pre-Sandstorm PoB, where we tried to figure out a good way of actually fixing our crit without Sandstorm, as we will have to play without Sandstorm most likely for way longer than previously. And that is done using either Shaper or Hunter body armor, which you can roll with Dense Fossils to get the prefixes. Then prefixes cannot be changed Reforged Caster for guaranteed spell crit. I think it has to be eye level 84 to be able to roll tier 1 spell crit, but if you have that, it is guaranteed to roll spell crit chance. Which is base crit chance. As I mentioned previously, Hexblast has very low base crit chance, so it is very strong modifier. I mean, I can show you real quick. It gives us basically 20% crit, which for one slot on a body armor is insane. That's why we dropped the unique body armor, even though it's nice to use uniques, as it is a lot easier to get going, but yeah. We also changed our skill tree to play 4 cluster setup, pretty much the same as I played last league. Not too different. Overall, the build is very similar to what it was last league. PoB will actually show lower damage numbers than it was showing last league, but that is because PoB fixed the bug when it comes to mine throw speed, and it now properly counts minefield, the extra little time that you have when you are throwing 5 mines with minefield, but it will be the same as it was last league. It just shows slightly lower in PoB. And if you watch my playthrough last league, or if you want to check out the videos that I published last league from league start, you will see that damage was never an issue. There is quite a lot of content that I published on YouTube last league, and I played Hexblast on league start, and tier 17s weren't really a problem for this build unless the mods were ridiculous, and they got easier this league, so I don't really see what this build would have problems with. And then we have the Sandstorm Visage version, which, I mean, as you can see, damage is definitely not a problem on this version. Obviously, during pre-stack, we have even more damage, as high impact makes it so we have higher chance for double damage. The reason we are using high impact now compared to Blast Chain Mine, which I was initially recommending in my 3.24 guide, is because we are also using automation support. Automation support is an absolute deal breaker for mine builds. It makes the mine build feel amazingly smooth. Like, you don't have to do anything. It feels like a self-cast build, but without like any of the downside that self-cast builds have. It's amazing. It just doesn't make sense to use Blast Chain with it, so you have to switch to high impact mine. But otherwise, if you haven't played a build with automation yet, I highly recommend doing so, because I don't really know what GGG was thinking. It literally made the mine build, like, it is better than left click. It might not sound better than left click, but if you play with it, it is better than left click. Because left click, sometimes you're just not holding it, especially on single target, but automation is always going off. It felt so smooth to play. It's really hard to describe, but highly recommend trying it out if you haven't yet. And if you somehow played Hexblast last league without it, make sure to include it this league. I've included some crafting notes for the endgame version of this build, so I will quickly go over them. For wand, you want a wand with spell damage implicit, eye level 82 or lower, and in requirement not too high that you can actually fulfill. And the goal here is spell damage +2, and then ideally crit chance, crit multi, and crafted mind throw speed on the suffixes. But it can be quite hard to guarantee suffixes with good tiers. But I will go over how to craft it. So you get a fractured wand with eye level 82 or below with either spell damage or crit chance fractured. Spell damage allows you to go for insane prefixes, but increased crit chance makes it a lot easier to finish the suffixes. And when we use free socket resonators with corroded metallic shattering, every time it hits 6 mods, which is every 12 fossils, the prefixes will always be +2 and spell damage, but there's a decent chance the spell damage will be low if you are not using fractured spell damage. Then we try to annul the suffix. Hopefully we hit a suffix we don't care about, and then we do prefix is going to be changed, reforge crit. That guarantees at least 1 crit mod, and then you have to kind of proceed from there depending on what happened. But oftentimes you would finish this with Veld Chaos or Augment Crit, or you just grab Mind Throw Speed and you are okay with a 5 mod wand, is completely fine. Sometimes it's not worth the upgrade, especially with the current prices of Veld Chaos. Sorry, Veld Orbs. I forgot they renamed them. For shield, ideally you would get a fractured base, and then you spam Crit Chance Essence to get decent suffixes. Suffix is going to be changed, Reforge Chaos, guaranteed +1 Chaos, Craft Life. Pretty simple. For belt, you definitely want to use Zeal Essence if you can. Just try to get something decent. I mean, obviously, maybe you won't have the percent life, but since life rolls are going higher this league, it might not be a big problem. You might have the same amount of life just through flat. And that is pretty much it. For rings, I would recommend Reforged Caster to get some decent Curse on Hit rings, as it's pretty likely to hit a Curse on Hit. And for amulets, I would recommend fracturing either life or all attributes. I think all attributes is a lot easier to craft though. Then you spam Scorn Essence for crit multi till you hit last good suffix. Suffix is going to be changed, Reforged Chaos, and then craft life or craft minus mana cost, whatever you need at the moment. And for clusters, I already mentioned the medium clusters, you need to Reforge Crit. And for the large clusters, you should be using either Reforged Chaos or better yet, using Aberrant Fossil. One of the best ways to increase your damage in the mid-game or end-game is this Balance of Terror with Wither on hit if you have cast Despair in the past 10 seconds. And this means you have to add Despair to your links and cast it somewhere. You don't have to hit the boss or anything, but you just have to cast it. And it gives you 100% chance to Wither every hit. And this is just way better than Withering Step or Wither Totems or anything. I mean, Wither Totems are very unreliable. I don't even include them in the PoB DPS, even though I still have them in my links, as I think they do something. But they're so unreliable that I don't even want to put them in the actual config. But this is like guaranteed 15 Wither stacks every time. Extremely strong, but it might be quite pricey. So if you can afford it, buy it. If you cannot, you can save up for it and get it later. There's one way to get some Wither early, and that is using Sin's Rebirth. I don't really see that many people talk about this, but Unholy Might gives you 25% chance to Wither on hit. And Sin's Rebirth is like a decent source of Unholy Might. So I would recommend this if you are trying to do Sanctum or bossing super early and you don't have access to the Balance of Terror. It can help quite a bit. And you can just drop one of your flasks if you don't need Diamond Flask by then, or you can just drop Jade Flask for bossing, as it doesn't matter too much. Speaking of flask, one of the most common questions I get when it comes to this build is, how do we fix the Mana Flask issue? So number one, Mana Flask is not an issue on this build, it's just an optimization. If you really don't want to use Mana Flask and you want to make your build worse, you can drop these nodes, grab One Step Ahead and Heartstopper, and then grab Eldritch Battery. I think it sucks. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think you should ever do this. If you are gonna do this, you are probably better off playing Saboteur. So for my build guides, I don't really include a solution to mana, as I think any solution to mana through like minus mana cost, mana regen is just way too expensive and not worth going for, at least on the live version of this build. I played the CI version of this build 3-4 leagues ago, and I actually think the real endgame version of this build with the new bases might be CI again, and I will probably try to make it work in hardcore. But you might be able to fix mana there because you just get a lot of intellect, which gives you mana, and then mana regen becomes a lot more efficient. And I think on CI you could probably fix it. I don't think you are fixing it on the hybrid version, sadly. So there's no fixing to the Mana Flask issue, as it's not really an issue, it's just part of the build. If you can't handle it, Palsteron has an amazing build where he uses EB on Saboteur. You could use EB on Trickster, but I think you lose the only reason to play Trickster, so I just wanted to address that as I get that question a lot. And I mean, I understand why. It can be quite annoying to use Mana Flask on bossing. In mapping, I don't think people ever have problem with it. But what I would recommend if you have issues with Mana Flask while bossing because you press it too much, because you're not used to it, just get a second one. Just boss on double Enduring Mana Flask. It's completely fine. I mean, the other flask, as I said, don't really matter that much. Just get more Mana Flasks. Play like 2 life, 2 mana for bossing if you have to. It's completely fine. And eventually you will get enough damage that it will never be an issue because you kill most bosses during like 1 or 2 Mana Flask uses. So I just wanted to address that. But hopefully that covers pretty much everything. Let me know if I missed anything. Ask questions in the comments. Ask questions in my Twitch chat. I'll make sure to answer them as much as I can. And I will see you guys on League Star. Hope you guys have a good one. Bye, everyone.